There is a very unsettling feeling that you might get if you suddenly woke up one day and realized that your body had been changing without you realizing it. And I don't mean changing as, we all do as we grow up. It's not like you could point to it in a photograph and say, yes, right there, that's the moment it happened. I'm talking about the kind of change that hides in plain sight. Maybe one morning you're brushing your teeth and you glance at the mirror, you pull at your cheek a little bit, and you say, was that there last night? But you don't sit with it. You don't spiral. You shrug it off. You chalk it up to stress. Maybe you're getting older. Maybe it's bad lighting. Anything else but something serious. Because when change happens slowly enough, your brain makes it feel normal. For Paul Karason, it began as a shift in tone, not in his mood. I'm talking about his skin tone. A faint grayness in his skin that deepened so gradually, it never felt urgent. He was never alarmed. He didn't even realize it was happening. It was just a slow drift towards something that ultimately looked off. You know what I mean? It's like buying a small plant, putting it in a new pot, putting it in your home, waiting 6 months, taking care of it, and suddenly you turn around one day and go, when did you grow up? That change in Paul didn't feel dramatic. It just happened. It's happening so slowly, your brain just edits it out until one day, it's not you noticing the change, it's someone else. They look at you a little longer and they say, what happened to you? Because Paul Karason didn't look pale, he didn't look sick, he just looked gray. So how do you miss your own skin changing color? Because Paul wasn't chasing attention, he wasn't trying to become famous. He was just trying to fix something small, something rather annoying, something that had become a painful part of his everyday life. And in doing that, he walked into a permanent mistake. Because the fix that Paul chose wasn't an experimental surgery, it wasn't some underground procedure, it was something that he could buy, something that sounded natural, something that had been around for centuries, something called colloidal silver. Before the headlines, Paul was just dealing with a problem that wouldn't quit. Dermatitis, just constant irritation, the thing that's not really emergency room scary, but it's always there and it's always bothering you. And when something keeps coming back like that, you start doing what a lot of people do. You widen the search. You look for anything that might finally make it stop. And that's how Paul came across colloidal silver. Not as some historical remedy, but as a modern natural solution. It was marketed as clean, pitched as antibacterial, and it was talked about like it could support your body against basically everything. It sounded simple, it sounded old-fashioned, which in a weird way made it kind of feel safe. And Paul didn't just buy the bottle off the shelf, he started using a kit that lets him make it himself. He drank it, he put it on his skin, and over time it stopped being something he tried and started being something that he did every single day. Now listen, he wasn't just taking a few drops of this stuff, he was drinking roughly 10 to 20 ounces of a highly concentrated home-brewed mixture and rubbing it all over his skin and directly onto his face. And when something finally feels like it's working, how hard is it to stop, right? Paul would later say he noticed improvements. His acid reflux eased up, and some of the irritation wasn't as bad. So in his head, it made sense. This helps me, and if it helps me, why wouldn't I keep using it? Maybe I'll take a little more. And that's kind of how it happens, because once you've convinced yourself that something's really working, you don't really go looking for reasons that it might not be working. And that risk starts to feel distant. It starts to feel abstract, like they're about someone else. You think, yeah, maybe that happens to some guy in a medical journal, but definitely not me. I'm fine. And honestly, it didn't even feel risky. It wasn't some hard drug. It wasn't some experimental surgery. It was something marketed as natural. It was old school, and it was marketed as being harmless.
Well, it all started when I saw an ad in a magazine. It was for a colloidal silver generator. About the same time, I heard that colloidal silver was useful for treating petroleum poisoning. And I had a friend that had petroleum poisoning from working in a machine shop from the time he was, I don't know, 7 or 8 years old. I ordered the generator, and I'd go see him every day, and we'd each make a glass of colloidal silver, and we'd drink it.
And you were drinking it for his petroleum poisoning?
Well, I figured I might as well drink it too if it was such wonderful stuff.
Yeah, because you thought it was going to do what for you?
I had no idea.
But why would you drink it if you didn't think it was going to have some health benefits?
Oh, I wasn't going to say, here, take this. You know,
Yeah.
I thought the kindest thing to do was to take it with me. You know, just make them more comfortable with the idea. And it was about that time that I noticed it having some interesting effects
Like what?
for me. Well, I'd had a problem with acid reflux.
Mm-hmm.
In less than 3 days, that was just gone. So I kept taking it, drinking it.
Drinking it every day?
Yeah, oh, yeah.
And drinking how much of it? I don't know what
Oh,
colloidal...
at least a 10-ounce tumbler.
A 10-ounce tumbler?
A 10-ounce tumbler.
So he wasn't there weighing side effects, he was just trying to feel better. But the thing is, while Paul was busy weighing the argument in his head, his body was quietly keeping score. It wasn't listening to his excuses, it was just sitting there, taking notes, and waiting for the bill to come due. At first, it didn't even register as a symptom. To Paul, it just looked like bad lighting. He'd catch a glimpse of himself in the mirror and do that thing we all do when we notice something weird. He made an excuse for it. Oh, I'm just tired. Maybe I'm stressed. Maybe I'm just getting older. He basically gaslit himself, and honestly, why wouldn't he? It didn't hurt. It wasn't like he woke up with a giant neon sign pointing at his face. It was just one of those tiny, annoying changes you assume will just go away on its own. But the color didn't go away. It wasn't a phase, it was an accumulation. It just kept stacking up layer by layer until the bad lighting became a permanent part of his skin. Day by day, that gray tint started leaning into blue. But it was subtle. It wasn't enough to make him panic. It was just enough for him to be looked at for a second too long, and you find yourself thinking like, wait, is he okay? Is that just the light? But then the bubble popped. Someone finally said it out loud. A friend of his was looking at him, and you can just imagine the hesitation. That look where someone's brain is buffering because it can't quite make sense of what it's seeing. So finally, they just came out and asked the one question Paul had been avoiding. Paul, man, what is going on with your skin?
When did you start to notice, hey, I'm a little blue?
It wasn't until a friend came by, and who hadn't seen me in a while, and he looks at me and, what did you do? I said, well, what are you talking about? He said, well, what do you got on your face? I said, I don't have anything on my face. He said, well, yes, you do. You better come here. And he stood in front of a mirror with me, and then, I thought, oh, gee.
You see, when you're the one living in your own skin, you adjust in these tiny, microscopic steps. You don't notice the change because you're evolving with it. But the rest of the world, they aren't on that same journey that you are. They don't see the process, they only see the result. And once that friend pointed it out, Paul started seeing it everywhere. He'd catch his reflection in a car window or a store mirror, and it would just hit him. He'd stand under those harsh fluorescent lights in the grocery store, and that kind that makes everyone look a little rough, and his skin would look even weirder. So how do you react when someone points out a change you've been ignoring for years? Paul wasn't trying to stand out, but now he couldn't blend in. The look started first, quick glances that turned into stares, and then came the questions from strangers who didn't feel the need to be subtle. And then the jokes that are kind of, just kidding, until you realize they're the only thing people can think of to say. And with every reaction, the color stopped being a private detail and became a public fact, something that walked into the room before he did. Eventually, Paul found out there was an actual name for what was happening to him, a real medical term and not some internet nickname or a joke, an actual diagnosis. And that name came with heavy realization. This wasn't something that he could just fix. It wasn't like his skin was dyed and it could wash off. It wasn't a rash that would clear up with some cream. This wasn't a phase. Something had literally gotten into his system and it had decided to move in permanently. When Paul finally went looking for answers, he learned the word for the blue-gray color, Argyria. When you ingest silver over and over, especially in the kind of amounts that Paul described, most of it leaves your system, but not all of it. Think about it like this. Your body doesn't really have a trash can for silver, so instead of passing through you, it starts to settle. It finds a spot in your tissue, specifically the deeper layers of your skin, and it just sits there. At first, silver building up in your body doesn't really sound dramatic, right? It's not like a tumor, it's not like some immediate crisis, it's more like dust collecting on a bookshelf that you never even look at. You don't notice it until something activates it. And here's where it gets strange, because it's sunlight. When sunlight hits those tiny silver particles trapped in your skin, it triggers a chemical reaction. They darken. And once they darken, they don't go back. It's the exact same tech used in old school photography. Back in the day, they used silver to develop film because when the light hits silver, it changes color. So Paul's skin wasn't just changing. It was, in a very literal way, he was being developed like a photograph. And once those darker compounds form in the skin, they don't just rinse out. They don't fade after a few showers, and they don't peel off like a bad sunburn. They stay. So yeah, you can stop taking silver to keep it from getting worse, and you can avoid the sun to slow the darkening, but the discoloration itself is notoriously hard to undo once it sets in. So what do you do when the thing you thought was helping you turns out to be permanent? Paul finally had an answer, but it wasn't the kind of answer that makes you feel better. And the really messed up part, by the time you actually understand what's happening, the damage had been living in your skin for years. There's no Control-Z for this. So even if Paul could find a way to make peace with what was happening inside of his body, he still had to face what was happening outside of it. Because the second his face became a spectacle, the story stopped being about health, and it became about the world watching.
Now, when he walks down the street, people stare in disbelief because he is blue. Yes, you are blue. You are blue.
You're blue. Blue.
You are blue. This is a first on the Oprah show. We have never had a blue man. Have a seat. Have a seat. So how did this happen? You weren't born blue, obviously.
At first, it was just small pieces, local stations, a quick segment about a rare medical condition, the kind of story that runs between weather and sports. But unusual stories travel, right? Especially visual ones. And Paul's was extremely visual. So what started as curiosity slowly changed into coverage. And coverage turned into interviews, and interviews turned into something bigger. And then it just exploded. By late 2007 and into 2008, the story jumped from local news to national outlets, morning shows, big headlines, the whole circuit. And somewhere in there, it stopped being a story about a guy named Paul. It started being a story about the man who turned blue.
A man who turned his skin the color blue.
Amazing story. I've never heard of anything like that.
This is a first on the Oprah show. He really is blue.
This California man is blue, literally.
These interviews all kind of followed the same rhythm. The host trying to be polite, and the camera's not trying to stare too long, but staring anyways. Because let's be honest, the first thing that people noticed wasn't the explanation. It was the color. That split-second moment where your brain goes, what am I looking at? And once that moment happens, the nicknames aren't far behind. They called him the Blue Man. They called him Papa Smurf. And those names traveled farther than his actual name ever did. And that's the strange shift, right? That's when a person turns into a spectacle. So what happens when the world stops seeing you as a person and starts seeing you as content?
Crikey, he's like the Hulk, except he's gone blue instead of green.
He's quite the guy despite the fact that he's blue.
Paul did his best to explain himself in these interviews. He wasn't out there being reckless, and he definitely wasn't trying to shock anyone for clout. He just kept telling people the same simple truth. He was a guy who had a health problem who thought he'd finally found a fix. He thought he found relief. But that's the reality of the internet, right? An explanation doesn't go viral, a visual does. People didn't care about the context, they just wanted the thumbnail. So the clip turns into a headline, and the headline turns into a punchline, and eventually that joke becomes the only way strangers know how to talk to you. Paul tried to stay out of sight. He avoided crowds. He always kept his head down, and then suddenly, this very thing that made him feel isolated was the reason people wanted to meet him. And somewhere in the middle is what he calls blue madness. He realized something. He didn't hate being on camera. In fact, he kind of liked it. The applause, the curiosity, the hugs, the recognition instead of ridicule. After years of being stared at in silence, now people were cheering. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't hiding. He was being invited. So, yeah, he leaned into it. Oprah, Letterman, Kimmel. He was getting calls from Germany, England, Korea, everywhere. For a man who once felt too strange to belong, these 15 minutes of fame probably didn't feel like exploitation. They felt like acceptance. People don't really think about, when they're laughing and scrolling past the thumbnail, and when the cameras actually pack up, the internet moves on and travels to the next viral thing. But Paul doesn't get to log out of the thing that made him interesting. Later on, the follow-up stories painted a much darker picture than those morning show interviews. We're talking serious financial strain and housing instability. At one point, he was actually living in a shelter. He spoke pretty openly about how impossible it was to find a job.
People are rather reluctant to hire blue people or people that are noticeably different.
I mean, think about it. Can you imagine how an employer's face would look when that different walks into the interview? Before he even opens his mouth, the decision has already been made. So no, the attention didn't turn into some big opportunity or a payday. It just turned into recognition. And honestly, that recognition can be a cage. Because once the world decides your appearance is your identity, you lose the right to be anonymous. You don't get to be just some guy picking up milk at the grocery store. You don't get to have a normal, quiet, bad day without it turning into a spectacle for everyone else. You're basically stuck playing a character that you never asked to be every time you step out your front door.
I do tend to avoid public places as much as I can.
The thing that changed his life wasn't rare or illegal. It was something that you could buy at the store, make in your kitchen, and use every day while being told over and over again, this is perfectly safe. If you only look at Paul's story from the outside, it's easy to frame it like a one-person mistake. But Paul didn't invent colloidal silver. He didn't dig it out of some underground lab. He found it the way millions of other people find things now. A product with clean packaging, confident testimonials, and just enough sciencey language to make it feel legitimate. Because colloidal silver didn't spread because it was hidden, it spread because it was sold and packaged as a germ killer. And for years, colloidal silver lived in this fuzzy space where something could be widely available without being widely understood. And even when regulators stepped in, it didn't vanish, it just changed what it did. The FDA took the position that colloidal silver products marketed to treat or prevent disease weren't actually recognized as safe and effective. But here's how they got away with it. They stopped calling it a treatment. You see, if you use the word cure without any proof, the government comes for you. But if you use words like support, promote, or maintain, suddenly you're in the clear. It's this weird legal gray area where you can imply a miracle without actually promising one. So when the regulators finally started cracking down on the big loud claims, the industry didn't pack up and leave. They got quieter. They basically swapped out science for vibes. They traded treats for supports. They traded cures for helps. And most importantly, they replaced evidence with testimonials. Because a good story does the job that evidence is supposed to do, but without any of the legal risk. And when you're uncomfortable and you're dealing with something that won't go away, testimonies hit harder than uncertainty.
Well, I think it's fair to say that with the color you see on the outside is the same color on the inside. This is
organs?
Not just organs. And doctors are always concerned that because silver is a heavy metal that it can damage internal organs like liver and kidneys. And I know Paul and I may look at this very, very differently because I obviously come from the medical establishment, and I think Paul looks at the medical establishment with askew. So it's not something I could recommend because there's no science behind it, and yes, I worry about the safety. And the FDA has been very strong saying that there's no reason to take it.
Paul, any side effects that you've experienced, like kidney damage that you know of, seizures, neurological problems, headaches, anything like that?
Absolutely not.
Okay, so why do miracle remedies feel most convincing when you're the most desperate for relief? And that's the psychological trap. See, if you try something and you feel even remotely like 5% better, your brain snaps this internal rubber band between the cause and the effect. And you began telling yourself, oh wow, this is working. This is the answer. So you keep going.
So why did you keep using it?
Because of some profound benefits that I had received from
Like what?
using it. Well, like no more acid reflux, no more sinus troubles. My arthritis went away.
And if the downside of that choice is slow and the harm is quiet and creeps in over the years, you don't even register it as damage. You just register it as life, right? You adjust to the new normal until it's impossible to ignore, until it's visible. And once it finally becomes visible, there's a second trap. And it's not medical anymore, it's identity. Because at that point, the question isn't just, did this product do this to me? It's, okay, if this product did do this to me, what now? Admitting it doesn't change the color of his skin, and it doesn't undo the stares from strangers. It doesn't rewind the interviews. So what does admitting it actually give you?
If you could change back to the way you were, would you do it?
I'm not sure.
Really?
Really.
So at a certain point, doubling down on belief becomes a form of self-protection. It's not because Paul made a bad choice. It's because he was human. He was just trying to make his own choices feel survivable. And I'd argue that when the truth offers you nothing but regret, sometimes it's easier to stay in the story that you already built. That's why Paul's story isn't really about a blue man. It's about how easy it is to slide into something permanent while you're chasing something temporary. Relief. And by the time the internet got bored and moved on, Paul was still living inside this consequence, which brings us to the final piece of the story. What Paul's life looked like after the cameras left, and what cosmetic really means when it changes the way the world treats you. One of the messed up things about Argyria, I'd say, is how it gets described. It's described as cosmetic, as if the word automatically means no big deal. But cosmetic can change how strangers look at you, how someone hires you. Cosmetic can change how safe you feel walking into a room. And Paul lived inside that reality for years. The attention didn't turn into security, the jokes didn't fade just because the news cycle moved on, and once people knew him as Papa Smurf, it got harder and harder for him to be anything else. And the years after the interviews, follow-ups painted a quieter, darker picture. There was financial strain, instability, a life that didn't get easier just because the explanation became public. But then in 2013, Paul Karason died at age 62. Reports at the time described serious acute health problems, things like heart complications, pneumonia, and stroke. But there's no public record proving Argyria itself caused his death. But even if the condition didn't kill him, it changed the shape of his life. And I'd argue that if a remedy can permanently change how the world treats you, is it really just cosmetic? So what's the takeaway? It's not don't be curious, it's not don't try to fix your own problems, and it's definitely not laugh at the guy on TV, it's just be careful. Because when something claims to cure everything, it's usually selling you a feeling. It's certainty, it's control, it's hope. And hope is powerful, right? But chemistry doesn't care what you meant to do. It doesn't care what you were promised. It just keeps track quietly, patiently, until one day someone looks at you, pauses, and says, "Hey, what happened to you?" Before we go, thank you for watching this video. We have plenty more on this channel, but if you want to hear more of history's mysteries or life's disturbing discoveries, make sure you like, subscribe, and ring that bell for notifications. I will see you in the next one. Bye.